Welcome. I'm Karen Lips, the president of the Network of Enlightened Women. Here at New, we have deemed 2021 the year of the conservative woman. As part of this programming, we are featuring 12 women, one each month, as our Conservative Woman of the Month. This month, we are excited to have Christina Bain join us. Christina is the visiting researcher on human trafficking at the Boston University Center for the Study of Europe. She is the former and founding director of the Harvard Kennedy School's Program on Human Trafficking in Modern Slavery, a program that she designed, developed, and implemented with the mission of creating data-driven public policy solutions to human trafficking. Prior to the Harvard Kennedy School, Christina was appointed by Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney as the executive director of the Governor's Commission on Sexual and Domestic Violence, a statewide commission of nearly 350 public and private sector partners. Welcome, Christina. Today we're talking about a very heavy topic, human trafficking. Could you tell us a little bit about how big the problem of this is in the United States and abroad?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me, Karen. And it's truly an honor to have the privilege to talk to you today and be the Conservative Woman of the Month. So to give you a sense of the scope of the problem, there's a variety of statistics out there that are debated often. For those of us, particularly in the academy, we like debating numbers. So globally, there's a range of numbers, and they typically range when giving statistics from between 25 million to 40 million victims in the world today. And victims are recruited into situations of labor trafficking. That is the most predominant form of trafficking. And you have sexual trafficking, which is commercial sex, prostitution, etc. And then you also have another form of human trafficking called organ trafficking, or the trafficking in persons for the purpose of organ removal, that it's often not talked about as much.
And can you talk about, do you have data on demographics, how much this impacts women versus men?
It does disproportionately affect women and girls more in terms of sex trafficking. Although we are still looking for more data and more accurate data on men and boys, we do know that men and boys are more susceptible to labor trafficking. However, again, these are human trafficking is really difficult to measure because it is an invisible crime. You have significant trauma. Victims, often by the time they're found, how do you describe what happened to you and where that occurred? It often gets confused with human smuggling, which is a different crime, but obviously related. But sometimes in the media it does get mixed up. So often when you're identifying these cases, sometimes it's very difficult to put that clear identification on a victim of trafficking. So that's why we're still working on the numbers. I will say, though, gender plays a key role in all forms of trafficking, and particularly for women and girls, from a cultural standpoint, from even here in the United States. So they are, like I said, disproportionately affected.
Well, and in combating this, do you find that there are certain areas of the country where we see it more, or certain types more, and how do you go about combating this? As you mentioned, it's often an invisible problem.
Sure. So in the United States, we see more prosecution, particularly on sex trafficking, and as opposed to labor trafficking. But overall, we know globally that there is more labor trafficking in the world. So in terms of the United States.
And when you say labor trafficking, could you give an example?
Sure. So labor trafficking is when you have, there's a variety of categories. You can have everything from someone enslaved in a factory setting, in like a sweatshop, but it can be any sector. You can have it in construction, in agriculture, in the electronics sector, in the fishing sector. Any sector can have trafficking within it. You also have other categories that fall into labor trafficking. You have something called domestic servitude, where someone is kept in a private home And that's often a very difficult form of trafficking to detect because victims are truly isolated. And you often see this in different areas of the country where people are keeping domestic servants and they are subject to sexual abuse. They are subject often to torture. Their passports may be taken, etc. You have another form of trafficking that we don't necessarily see in the United States, but you see in other parts of the world called child soldiers or enslavement in the military, in the militia. And you have children and even women and girls who are enslaved, and often they can also have sexual trafficking as a component and additionally sexual abuse. So that gives you some examples of labor trafficking.
Well, it seems like there's so many different types. It's got to be hard to pinpoint and sort of difficult to solve and address.
It is.
I'd be curious, how did you get into this area?
So that's a terrific question. So I can go back to a bit to my political background. So I worked on campaigns and elections. I was very active in my college years in working on campaigns and elections, and I happened to work for amazing people who won. And then I started in the Massachusetts governor's office. I worked for Governor Jane Swift, her administration, and I worked in Governor Romney's administration, and I was actually in Lieutenant Governor Carrie Healey's office. And in Massachusetts, we have something called the Governor's Council to Address Sexual Assault and Domestic Violence. At the time I was in Swift administration, the Romney administration, was called the Governor's Commission. And that was an area that falls to the Lieutenant Governor. Because Governor Swift was also an acting governor at the time, she had to fulfill the duties of both Lieutenant Governor and Governor. And so the commission fell to her, and just like it did to Carrie Healey, Lieutenant Governor Carrie Healey. And so I had the opportunity, because of where I was, to start to learn about this commission. And ultimately, when I was in the Romney administration, I started leading the policy work with the Lieutenant Governor on issues of sexual and domestic violence. And that's where I learned about human trafficking within particular, even Massachusetts. And I think when I started learning about it, it was between 2004, 2005. We didn't have a state law in Massachusetts on human trafficking, state law pending. And that's where I really started to learn about, how this was even happening in Massachusetts. There was also a case, I live north of Boston. There was a case, a federal case at the time, because we didn't have a state law, that took place right behind my local mall in Massachusetts. And so that really hit it home for me that this isn't something happening abroad. It's happening literally in my own backyard, right behind my local mall, where it was an international case where female victims were being moved in the Boston area for the purpose of prostitution. And they were from all different countries in Asia. And this was something that, again, was happening right in my own backyard.
I remember reading a story once about sex trafficking, a group that was broken up in Ohio, that it was done at truck stops. And you think, wow, how are you supposed to find that? That's so challenging, I imagine, from law enforcement.
It is. And actually, there's an amazing organization called Truckers Against Trafficking that I still work with on and off. And they've been training truckers at truck stops to see, in terms of what they may see there, what may be happening, because you have particularly women, girls, and also men and boys as well. But to the extent you have them moving across state lines, moving across interstates. Ohio is, the Midwest, an epicenter, of, truck stops, et cetera, with interstate commerce. And to see, they're exploiting these young girls and women and men and boys at these truck stops. So the truckers are actually a grassroots organization that was founded by a family. They're out in Colorado, and
it sounds great.
They're amazing, and they're a wonderful organization, and their training, not only in the United States, but their training programs have gone globally. They've trained truckers in Canada. They're also branching out into other sectors. and they're doing really, amazing work. And they work with state governments and local officials to train in individual states as well. So it's when we're talking about, where you fit and how do you tackle this problem, which I know was an earlier question that I didn't get to, but I think where you find where you fit is, you just take one segment of this. So they had an interest in really working with the truckers and working with transportation companies. And so that was something that hadn't been done at the time. And so they created a grassroots organization around it. So they look about where they could fit in the movement to really make a difference.
So you mentioned one bright spot. Could you talk about other areas of progress and where we've seen successes in combating human trafficking? In particular, I think some of our audience would be interested in combating sex trafficking.
Sure, absolutely. I think that there's been tremendous strides. I mean, since I got into this, which is now going on 15, 16 years, that we've seen, looking at the demand for sex trafficking and how do you address it from a prevention standpoint, looking at not only you have a focus on the victim, but you also have a focus on the buyer. And what does that look like? In other countries in the world have had laws that have addressed this more aggressively. In the United States, we have different quote unquote demand-based programs that are going on around the country. There's something I can talk about that exists in different states called a John School, where you have those who've been convicted of purchasing commercial sex. They go to a program where they learn about, what is really going on with this. They hear about public health issues. They may hear from a survivor of trafficking and what they found. And even though some said, okay, this is something that takes place for like 6 hours on a Saturday. How does this? But there is a statistic. There is statistics that there is a lower recidivism from those that previously bought commercial sex to buying commercial sex again after attending one of these John schools. So that's something that has been brought to the light. There was a major study that was done in 2008 it came out when I was at the Harvard Kennedy School, and by Apt Associates, that looked at the success of these John schools. And then I think there's truly a public policy trend even further in states, United States, to look at what we could do around this. So that's exciting thing. The other thing I can mention, because one of the areas that I work on is the role of business and looking at business and innovation in the private sector in their role in combating trafficking. When I first started really looking at that more exclusively in 2013, it was not something that was as much, I think, talked about it as today. Now you see all these conversations, especially at things that are not specifically about human trafficking conferences and forums. There's a conversation around global supply chains and what companies do. That was not so much, I would say, happening as often as it is now 10 years ago. And what's really exciting is that there's public policy trends around this to change laws, to really include and engage the business sector, because one of the things that I talk about is that when we talk about human trafficking, why is it so profitable? Why is it so lucrative? It's a business. It's just like any other, you have the legitimate economy and then you have the illegitimate. And this is where this falls. So I think that that's really exciting to see how corporations and others, I mean, we have a lot of work to do, but to just start having that conversation is terrific.
Well, and I would imagine that a lot of corporations and politicians really see this as a bipartisan issue. And we're often looking for bipartisan issues where women can work across the political spectrum to come together. Can you talk a little bit about the bipartisan nature of your efforts?
Absolutely. I think that this is one of the most impressive things about the human trafficking, anti-trafficking movement, is that it has remained truly bipartisan. It's not something that's, right or left. It's about slavery. It's about humanity. It's about freedom. And I think it's something that resonates with everyone. And we see, on the congressional level, such bipartisan support for this. On the congressional level, you have different groups of congressmen and women who convene to caucuses. They're surrounding human trafficking. There's bipartisan leadership both House and the Senate on this. And, you know, it's just really terrific to see. And there's not really a lot of issues that we can say polarized world right now where you see such bipartisan nature. I work with all different political spectrums on this issue. I work with um, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, Libertarians, you know, Green Party, what have you. I actually went to a State Department exchange in Northern Ireland, and I met with different officials from other political parties, you know, even globally. So we're working, you know, with different parties, even on a global level. So that's really exciting, and I think it really shows a lot, you know, that the movement has really kept being bipartisan.
Well, and as the new Congress convenes in DC, what would you like to see Congress do to address this problem, or state legislators? If you could have one of the legislative bodies do one thing to combat sex trafficking, what would you like to see them accomplish?
Well, I think that, you know, a lot is going on in the states, and I actually work with the Massachusetts governor's office on addressing human trafficking in Massachusetts. We actually have a committee on it, a subcommittee as part of the governor's council to address sexual and domestic. So we do work on the state level too, as well as globally. I think that what we're still working on is, I think, um, having a victim-centered approach and hearing from victims, including them in the conversation. I think they're the most important part of this process because they've been through this. And I think we're still working on understanding the problem and understanding what's happening. And I think, you know, one of the things I've been writing about in different outlets is that, you know, how the pandemic has also impacted this. We're seeing more things online. Sexual exploitation, child sexual exploitation in particular, we know is rising online. And I think that the more we can incorporate victims and survivors in their story, I think we'll have a much better anti-trafficking movement.
Well, thank you so much, Christina, for your leadership on this issue. And one thing I'd love to ask you is, what advice do you have for young conservative women who want to be effective leaders now or in the future?
Absolutely. So I think what I would just say is, you know, in terms of just general leadership, I mean, really follow your passion, you know, and see, there's a wonderful quote that's out there about your true vocation is where your passion meets the world. And I think that applies. It's not necessarily just conservative women, but it's, you know, anyone who's coming from, you know, a place of, you know, wanting to make an impact on humanity. And that's not right or left. That's, you know, from all scopes. And I think that there is a way, particularly I get often asked about in human trafficking in particular, it's such a large issue. How do I do this? What do I study? How do I, you know, if I want to work and combat human trafficking, do I have to study political science or do I have to study international relations or technology? You don't have to study just one thing in your doing your studies, either at the undergraduate level, graduate level, or you know, at the doctoral postdoc level. You know, it's something that you are looking at any topic, any subject, whether it's any of the ones I just mentioned, psychology, art, you know, et cetera, you can make a difference in trafficking, because trafficking, for example, is an issue that has so many tentacles, so many different pieces to it, that we need all types of academic disciplines. We particularly need more research still on this. You can make a difference with whatever you study.
I often feel like college students, you feel when you're in college that, you know, whatever your college major in is going to basically like determine your life path. I think part of your
Exactly.
is that, you know, you can study lots of different things. You
That's
might
right.
get to an issue later, but it's all about kind of paying attention to what you're really interested in and where you feel like you can have the most, make the biggest difference, and then going for that. Is that a good summary?
Right. And I think also too, you know, a true leader too also learns about the topic in depth before jumping into it. I think we have a tendency in society today to just jump into things, you know, have all these activities and get it done. And, you know, it's it's an immediate type of gratification. But I think what I have learned is that, study the topic, whatever topic it is, whether it's music, whether it's, like I said, art, whether it's, human trafficking, whatever, your passion is, business, but learn where you think you can fit, because you can't tackle it all. You can't do all at once. And so work with others, get a mentor, find different people in whatever field that you decide, and figure out, where you're most passionate about and where you fit. And also you can work regionally. Some people want to work domestically in whatever issue, they want to work globally. Some people do not want to work in the more grassroots level. Some want to work more with, in terms of trafficking, survivors. Some want to work in public policy. Some want to be elected and, make a difference in government. And all of these things are incredibly valuable.
Well, when you talk about, learning across different disciplines and how important it is to have people with different backgrounds, could you talk about what qualities you think make you excel as a leader, and what leadership qualities do you think are really important for young women to develop?
Oh, thank you. Well, one of the things that I, in terms of excelling, what I try to do is to be a really inclusive leader, and that also comes from my background of coalition organizing on political campaigns and elections, which I'm still, engaged in. And I think that everything is about moving coalitions, really, when it comes down to it, whether it's you're passing a bill, whether you're advocating for, a survivor, whether you're, writing something for a certain audience. It's all about building coalitions. And how do you do that? And I think one of the things we're not doing enough, and it's easier said than done, I think, some ways depend because of how polarized the world is. But I think really listening to people, and you can be um, listening but not really hearing. And I think it's really important to just take a moment, again, that idea of that instant gratification. Listen to someone and sit on it. Don't react, reflect, and then respond. And actually, one of my mentors, who actually lives in my town, who does career counseling, she taught me that early on. And uh, it was something that really stayed with me. About, we often miss that middle part about reflecting. And I think that's how you have successful movement. That's how you successfully pass legislation. That's how you successfully move issues forward. Because also that's a means of getting more information and getting more informed on an issue. Go in and you're not totally informed, it's gonna have potentially a backlash for what you want to advocate for. So those would be my pieces of advice.
Oh, thank you. And I want to turn it a little bit to conservative women. What unique challenges do you think conservative women face, and what advice would you have for them in terms of overcoming those challenges?
So I think that, by nature, I think some, um, areas where I think we're not as um, trained to be, I think, as outspoken. And I think it's, I often hear from conservative students, on different campuses, um, that it's quite difficult to speak. I think where you find common ground with people is just to find issues, like I said, like human trafficking, have a different approach. Right now the world is so polarized, like I said. I think, having, say, a bipartisan, whether you're in the college Republicans, you're in the college Democrats, you're conservative student union, you're in the progressive student union, maybe coming together on an issue. It could be anything from infrastructure, it could be anything from, say, trafficking to even environmental causes. I mean, there's some really interesting things going on, I would say, in the conservative movement about environmentalism. And I know that that's something that students in particular are really interested in. So I think finding a common topic like that to come together, which is something like human trafficking, found just such bipartisan support. If you do that, starting when you're learning leadership skills in your on a campus environment, have a forum, reach out, if comfortable, to another group on campus get co-sponsorships. That's always something I always did, and I still do in my work on campuses, is to get co-sponsorships of events. It helps in
It gets more
publication.
people in the room.
It gets more people, and so why not reach out? And if people don't get back to you, they don't get back to you, but just try again, and and see what coalitions might form from this. And you'll never know. I mean, I have seen some of the most interesting coalitions formed in human trafficking, especially when it comes to passing things like the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which that's our federal legislation on human trafficking, federal law on human trafficking. And we have to create legislation every so many years and reauthorize it. Fascinating. People come together during some of this to advocate on behalf of human trafficking. And you just never know where your allies come from.
Well, Christina, I really appreciate your message about finding common ground. I think that's part of what this series is all about, is showcasing conservative women leaders on different issues and hoping that some of the messages that come through can really appeal to women across the political spectrum. And I think
absolutely.
And one thing I think a lot of us women need to do a little bit more of is, sometimes things look ugly out there. And I imagine, especially in your area, some of the stories that you have to read about sex trafficking. So I'd love to hear a little bit about what you do to relax and recharge. You've been working in this field for over a decade. How do you keep your energy level up when I would imagine the problem and the sex trafficking continues, just remains out there?
That's a really good question. I would say something I'm first of all still working on. It's not something that I would say that I'm an expert in. I would say that sometimes I have to bring myself to read more cases, because you often get lost, I think, just like any human rights issue, criminal justice, you sometimes get lost in the bureaucracy of it. I work with all these different stakeholders and all these different groups. And, I often really try to read in depth about cases and things, even if, for example, what I'm working on may require more, crafting, say public policy, or it's not, I try to bring it home about why I do this. I actually, say, okay, I need to read, so much of this a week or whatever. Because when you're not so much because I don't work directly with survivors on everyday, really need to bring that home, because like I said, we need to hear more from survivors and we need to work more with them. And that's something I really try to make as an emphasis in my daily activities as much as I can. What I do though for fun, that's an excellent question. So I listen to a lot of music, particularly rock bands from the 1980s. I listen to a lot of what one would consider heavy metal rock, which some find very surprising. I've pretty much gone to all of these different concerts 7 or 8 times. It was very.
Who's your favorite 80s band?
One of the things that got really it was one of the the things that got canceled this summer in Boston. There was all of these different 80s metal hair bands were gonna have a concert at Fenway Park, and that got canceled. It was like 5 of them. We're talking like Def Leppard and Motley, it was like Motley Crue or something. I mean, it was like a whole group of these people who were touring, and then it got canceled. So right now I'm listening to a lot of Journey. I am a huge Journey fan. I am very interested in music, particularly of Steve Perry. I find his work very, very interesting, solo work. So I do listen to a lot of music. And then I also do art, and you can see some of my art actually in the background here, conveniently. And I've been doing art since high school. I actually had the opportunity to pursue art more full time and go to art school. I decided to go in a different direction and study political science, also concentrate in French language and literature. So I didn't go to and pursue art full time, but what I ended up doing with that is I actually illustrated for conservative student publication, and that's how I got my art out there. And I still do art to this day, and I actually give it to art auctions, local art college here in my area, and give it to them to sell for scholarships for their students.
Oh, that's wonderful, Christina. Well, thank you for sharing that little more personal story about
Thank
your
you.
and what you're into. I think it's great for our students to see not just the more professional work, but also see how you're helping your community and also keeping your hand in things that you really enjoy. You don't have to just focus on one topic, right? Like you can still be well-rounded.
Well, and actually, if I could, I'm actually the board chair for an organization called Artworks for Freedom, where it's the combination of art and trafficking. And some may say, well, how, would even art fit into this? It actually does. And we use art as a means of awareness and survivors sharing their stories. It's an amazing organization. So that even can combine with preventing and combating human trafficking, which is really exciting.
Thank you so much for joining us, Christina. And thank you for watching our Year of the Conservative Woman series. Thank you.